It began like any other Friday night in the Jennings household. The warm hum of conversation drifted from the kitchen, mingling with the comforting scent of tomato sauce and garlic bread. Diane Jennings, always meticulous, was loading the dishwasher, her hands moving with familiar rhythm while her husband Thomas sat at the dining table scanning headlines on his tablet. Upstairs, Michael Jennings finished a calculus problem with the speed and precision of someone who didn't need to study but did anyway. He was that kind of kid, quiet but curious, driven yet modest. He excelled in school, was polite to a fault, and had never missed a curfew in his life. Diane often joked that if there was ever a missing child alert in their town, it wouldn't be her son. He was too predictable, too careful. But that Friday, something shifted. Michael came downstairs at exactly 6:42 p.m., slipping his phone into the pocket of his hoodie. "I'm going to pick up the pizza," he said, grabbing the keys from the hook by the door. "You sure you don't want me to order delivery?" Diane asked without turning. "It'll be faster if I go. They're swamped tonight." That was true. It was the start of the high school football season, and Sergio's Pizza. Diane simply nodded. Thomas mumbled something about bringing back extra garlic knots, and then the door clicked shut. They would never hear it open again. Michael drove his silver Toyota Corolla through the dusky streets of Dayton, his playlist echoing familiar tunes. He stopped at Sergio's at 6:49 p.m. A teenage girl behind the counter greeted him. His order was ready, double cheese and pepperoni, paid in cash, signed the receipt. No hesitation, no sign of stress. No phone calls, no one followed him in. He left the pizzeria at 6:53 p.m. Witnesses remember his polite nod as he pushed through the door, pizza box in one hand, keys in the other. But he never made it home. At 7:22 p.m., Diane noticed the time. It was odd for Michael to be late. She checked her phone. No texts. She called voicemail. At first, she brushed it off. Maybe traffic, maybe he stopped for gas. But when 8:00 p.m. passed, and then 8:30, panic crept in like smoke under a door. Thomas took the car and started driving the route Michael always took, Sergio's. The main road, the side streets, but there was no sign of him. At 9:03 p.m., Diane called 911. By midnight, the police had issued a missing person bulletin. Michael Jennings, age 17, last seen wearing a gray hoodie and black jeans, driving a silver 2009 Corolla. Height, 5'11", green eyes, brown hair, no known mental health issues, no recent behavioral changes, honor roll student, soccer team goalie. By morning, the entire town was talking. At 5:41 a.m. the next day, a patrol car responding to a report of a suspicious vehicle found Michael's car. It was parked behind an old, boarded-up factory that had been out of use for years. The location made no sense. It wasn't on the way home. It wasn't even near anything familiar. The engine was still faintly warm. The doors were unlocked. His phone was inside, screen cracked but functional, the wallet untouched, stuffed with his student ID and $43 in cash. On the passenger seat sat the pizza box, steam long gone, but otherwise untouched. Not a single slice missing. There were no tire tracks other than Michael's. No fingerprints inside the car, but his own. No signs of struggle. No blood, no clothing fibers. No notes. No phone calls or texts after he left the pizzeria. It was as if he had driven to that strange, forgotten place and evaporated into the night air. The scent of pepperoni lingered, oddly mocking. Diane stood outside the police tape, her hands trembling as officers combed through the area. She refused to cry. Not yet. Not until she knew. He wouldn't do this, she kept saying. He wouldn't run. He's not that kind of boy. And everyone who knew Michael agreed. But with no leads, no sightings, and no explanation, the case began to cool before the week even ended. The media picked it up briefly. Honors student vanishes in Ohio. But without a sensational hook, it quickly faded. Theories spread, of course. Some whispered about drug involvement, but no evidence supported it. Others believed he'd run off with a secret girlfriend. A few even suggested abduction. But again, no signs. No suspects, no ransom notes, no surveillance footage of anyone else near the factory that night, just Michael, vanishing without a trace. Weeks passed, then months. Diane posted flyers, called news stations, hired a private investigator. Thomas grew quieter, unable to reconcile the loss. Michael's bedroom remained untouched, as if he might walk through the door any moment. The pizza box, now sealed in an evidence bag, sat in the local police evidence locker. A strange, sad monument to the last thing Michael ever touched. Eventually, the Jennings family's stories slipped into the fog of unresolved heartbreaks. Life in Dayton moved forward, as it always does, but Diane didn't. She marked every Friday with a candle in the window. The pizzeria closed 3 years later, replaced by a vape shop, but she kept a receipt from that night in a drawer, the edges fraying from how often she unfolded it. She refused to give up. Michael was out there, somewhere, somehow. And then, 10 years after that strange Friday night, a new piece surfaced, so small, so seemingly insignificant, but enough to make Diane's breath hitch in her throat. A mistake, one she never would have noticed before, a single, quiet clue hiding in plain sight. The days following Michael's disappearance settled into a rhythm that felt both surreal and suffocating. Diane Jennings awoke each morning with the same cruel illusion that maybe she had dreamed it, that any moment now Michael's door would creak open and she'd hear him grumble about cold cereal or ask for the car keys. But the house remained hollow, suspended in a quiet that screamed. Their marriage held firm, but only just. They communicated in glances, nods, logistical exchanges. Words, it seemed, had lost their usefulness. Investigators continued their interviews, retracing every known step Michael had taken. They examined the restaurant, questioned employees, analyzed security footage from neighboring stores and traffic cams. But nothing revealed itself. Sergio's Pizza, though fitted with 2 cameras at the entrance and counter, provided no usable video. The first camera had glitched and recorded only static that night. The second, mounted behind the counter, captured Michael signing the receipt and smiling at the girl behind the register. He turned, stepped out of frame, and never appeared on footage again. The police pored over external surveillance from nearby shops, but none showed Michael walking to his car or driving away. It was like a magic trick. Now you see him, now you don't. Frustration seeped into the investigation. The lead detective, Troy Benson, was seasoned but visibly unnerved by the lack of physical evidence. He told Diane, not unkindly, that teenagers sometimes choose to disappear. "There's no sign of foul play," he said, not meeting her eyes. "He left of his own will, probably got overwhelmed. Maybe there was something he didn't want you to know." Diane stared at him, her face carved from stone. "My son didn't run," she replied, voice level. "He doesn't keep secrets. If something was wrong, I'd have known." But the detectives weren't convinced. The lack of struggle, the unlocked car, the pristine scene, it all screamed voluntary exit. It didn't help that Michael's phone, though found in the car, had its call history erased. A technician recovered partial logs, but there was a suspicious 20-minute window between 6:54 and 7:14 p.m., just after he left the restaurant, where no activity was recorded. No calls, no texts, no app use. And then, inexplicably, at 7:15 p.m., the phone restarted on its own and stayed untouched. The Jennings family hired a private investigator named Wade Lorman, former FBI, hard-edged and direct. Lorman wasn't the empathetic type, but Diane didn't care. She didn't need comfort. She needed results. Lorman dug deeper than local police. He reviewed Michael's emails, searched through his search history, talked to his friends, teachers, teammates. Nothing stood out. No suspicious purchases, no hidden relationships, no evidence of depression or emotional turmoil. The only oddity he found was a deleted email from an account Diane didn't recognize. It had been removed hours before Michael left for Sergio's dentist, and even Lorman couldn't recover the account. All they had was the sender's address. Burner sacked 1,127 at maildrop.com. A dead end. Lorman said the deletion could have been accidental, or it could mean someone reached out, someone Michael didn't want tracked. But without more data, it was speculation. The town's interest began to wane. Flyers curled at the corners, news stations dropped the story, people moved on. Only Diane remained fixed, her hope calcifying into obsession. She cataloged every shred of information, tracked every tip, called Benson weekly. Thomas withdrew, retreating behind quiet dinners and longer hours. They argued more, about nothing, about everything. One evening, months into the case, Diane noticed something peculiar about the receipt from Sergio's. She'd studied it before, but this time her eyes caught on the way Michael's name was written. It wasn't his usual signature. It was sharper, more rushed. Almost like he'd been distracted, she brought it to Lorman, who took a photo but didn't seem impressed. Or he was in a hurry. Could mean something. Could mean nothing. Diane hated that phrase. It had become the refrain of this endless loop. Could mean something. Could mean nothing. The only clue that seemed promising was the strange location of the car. The factory behind which it was found had been closed since 2009. It used to make insulation foam, but was shut down due to safety violations. No recent activity, no squatters, no evidence of trespass. Lorman managed to track down a former security guard who worked there in the late 2000s. The man, Frank Devlin, was retired now, living in Columbus. He remembered the place being locked up tight. "Only 2 ways in," he said, voice raspy. "Hain Gate and the old delivery entrance on the side. But that one got sealed in 8 AS. Lorman asked if he thought anyone could have accessed the property. Devlin shrugged. Sure, if they were careful, or had the key. Diane's heart stuttered. "The key?" she asked. Devlin nodded. "Boss kept spares. They weren't cataloged real well. Could be one still out there." That led to another avenue. Property records, past owners, security logs, but again nothing concrete. The factory was sold to a real estate developer in 2013 who never broke ground on the renovation. Since then, it sat, untouched. The theories floated. Maybe Michael met someone there, maybe it was a dare, maybe it was all coincidence. Each explanation stretched thinner than the last. A local paper published an opinion piece a year later titled, "The Boy Who Chose to Vanish," suggesting that Michael had staged his disappearance as an act of defiance or independence. Diane tore it up. Her son was not a headline, he was not a metaphor. Where he was a person, and he was missing. On the second anniversary of his disappearance, Diane returned to the place behind the factory. She stood in the brittle grass, stared at the rust-streaked walls, and tried to imagine her son sitting there alone, pizza box beside him. It didn't make sense, none of it did. If he meant to vanish, why leave everything behind? Why park there of all places? And then there was the pizza itself. Diane had kept the original order slip, now yellowing at the edges. Something about it kept pulling at her, a detail she couldn't quite name. It haunted her like a word stuck on the tip of her tongue. She pinned it to the corkboard in her home office, among timelines and photos and maps, and stared at it every night. The case, according to the police, was dormant. They refused to use the word cold, but that's what it had become. Leads dried up. Media moved on. Lorman stayed in touch, but even his updates grew infrequent. Diane was alone in the search now, and yet she knew, with a certainty that lived deep in her marrow, that something had been missed. Something was wrong with that pizza order. Not just the signature, not just the name, something else. She just didn't know what. Not yet. Time had the strange habit of moving both slowly and all at once. 10 years had passed since Michael Jennings vanished, and yet, to Diane, it still felt like she was waiting in her kitchen with a pot of water boiling for pasta he never came home to eat. The world around her moved forward, neighbors moved away, the local grocery store turned into a car rental lot, the football field at Michael's high school was renamed after a donor who had never known her son. Yet Diane remained, tethered to a single moment, a single night, like her soul had been pinned there with invisible thread. Every September, she returned to what was once Sergio's Pizza. The original location had closed down just 3 years after Michael's disappearances, but the new owners of the building kept the signage. It now housed a Mediterranean grill, its yellow awning faded and flapping slightly in the wind. Diane came not for the food, but to stand near the spot where Michael had last been seen in the world. She would sit in her car across the street, sometimes for hours, eyes fixed on the brick storefront as if it could exhale answers if she watched long enough. This year, on the 10th anniversary, she did something different. Instead of just watching, she walked in. The new place had kept the original interior, same faded booths, same sticky floors, same clattering kitchen sounds behind the swinging door. There was a framed newspaper article near the register about the business's relaunch, and below it, in smaller print, a tribute to the original Sergio's. Diane stared at it for a long moment, tracing the photograph with her eyes. A wave of unease crept up her spine. Something was off, not with the article, but with her own memory of the night Michael vanished. She remembered asking what kind of pizza he wanted. He'd shrugged, distracted, and mumbled something about, "Whatever's fine." Diane had ordered double cheese and pepperoni, just as she always had, but when the police returned the receipt, the slip had shown pineapple as an added topping. It never made sense. Michael despised pineapple on pizza. He once spit out a slice at a school birthday party and said it tasted like warm fruit salad on cardboard. Diane had chalked it up to a mistake. Maybe someone else's order got mixed in. But now, standing in the glow of the kitchen light, she couldn't let go of that detail. She stepped toward the counter where a young man was wiping down a tray. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice low, almost apologetic. "I know this is odd, but do you know if any of the old employees from Sergio's still live around here?" The man looked up, puzzled. "Sergio's? That was, what, a decade ago?" "Yes," she said. "My son, Michael Jennings, he went missing. His last stop was here." Recognition flickered in the man's eyes. "I was just a kid back then, but my cousin worked here, Devin. He's up in Cleveland now, visits sometimes." Diane's pulse quickened. "Do you think... Would you mind asking him if he remembers anything about that night?" The man hesitated, but something in her face, something fragile and unwavering, moved him to nod. "I'll text him," he said. "Give me a second." Diane waited, heart pounding in her chest like a soft hammer tapping through bone. The boy glanced down at his phone, typed something quickly, and then waited. Several minutes passed, then the phone buzzed. He read, then looked up slowly. He says, "He remembers your son. Not his face exactly, but he said he took the call. Says the guy on the phone asked for pepperoni and pineapple." Diane blinked. "The call?" "Yeah," the boy said, frowning. "Back then, most people still ordered by phone. Devin says it was a phone order, not walk-in." The room tilted slightly. "That can't be," Diane whispered. "Michael left the house to pick up the pizza. He never called it in. He was going to order in person." The boy looked uncomfortable. "Maybe your son changed his mind and called from the car?" Diane shook her head slowly. "His phone was in the car. He didn't use it. The logs showed nothing during that time." Her mind raced. Why would someone place a phone order in Michael's name before he even arrived? Why request pineapple, something so unlike him, unless it was intentional? A warning, hands gripping the wheel. The receipt. It wasn't just wrong, it was fabricated. Someone else had placed that order. Someone who knew his name, knew the pizza joint, knew it would lure Michael in, and for the first time in years, Diane felt the ground shift beneath her. She drove home, her brain stitching together possibilities at a feverish pace. Once inside, she rifled through the drawer where she kept the box of case files, photos, statements, maps, digital copies of everything the police had collected. She dug out the receipt. Pepperoni, extra cheese, pepperoni, time-stamped 6:46 p.m. Diane stared at the numbers. She remembered Michael leaving the house around 6:42. There wouldn't have been time to call in an order unless he'd done it while driving. But he didn't. The police had traced all outgoing calls. Nothing matched, which meant whoever made the call did it ahead of time, impersonating him. The question was, why? She picked up her phone and called Wade Lorman. He answered on the fourth ring, his voice gravelly and skeptical. "It's been a while," he said. "Wade," she said, breathless. The pineapple was a signal. Someone used Michael's name to place the order. "He never called it in." "Hold on," Lorman replied. "You're saying—" "I'm saying it wasn't a mix-up. It was planted, like a breadcrumb." Lorman paused. "You still have the original timestamp on the receipt?" "Yes. Emailed it to me." "I'll pull the server logs. If there was a call, we can trace the number. Maybe it's still in the system." That night, Diane barely slept. She sat at her kitchen table, flipping through every detail of the case like a deck of cards. The pineapple wasn't just a topping. It was a deviation, a flag, the kind of small detail someone slips in when they're mocking you, or when they want to leave a mark without being seen. By morning, Lorman had called back. The number that placed the order was a burner, he said. Disposable, no contract, cash bought. But we know what store sold it, Wayne asked. A gas station 2 counties over, near the I-75 exit. That's miles away from Dayton. Exactly, he said. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. They were watching him, Diane, watching you. Diane sat in silence, her knuckles whitening around her coffee mug. The idea of someone orchestrating Michael's disappearance from a distance chilled her in a new way. This wasn't random. This wasn't a moment of chaos. It was constructed. It was careful. Someone who knew what would happen next. It was nearly 3 in the morning when Diane sat in the dim yellow light of her dining room, staring at the scanned copy of the order slip for what must have been the 100th time. Her printer had coughed it out with a soft hum that had startled her in the quiet. The paper trembled slightly in her hand as she tilted it toward the lamplight, searching again for the thing she now knew was there but had somehow missed for years. Her eyes locked onto the name printed at the top, Miguel Jameson. It was absurd. Her son's name was Michael Jennings, always had been, always would be. She tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was a simple error. Maybe the staff misheard him. Maybe the person taking the order had bad handwriting, or maybe a keystroke slipped. But the spelling was too deliberate. Miguel, the Spanish variation of Michael. Jameson, not Jennings, but close enough to raise eyebrows. That wasn't coincidence. That was camouflage. Her breath caught in her chest. Suddenly the pineapple topping seemed less like a mistake and more like a code. Miguel. Pineapple. A different last name. Diane pushed back from the table, her heart pounding in her ears. She opened her laptop and began cross-referencing names, accounts, anything she could find, but nothing in Ohio that matched. It was like the name had been conjured into existence for one purpose, placing that pizza order. Her mind reeled. Someone had used a nearly identical name, close enough to avoid suspicion at first glance, but different enough to obscure the truth if anyone looked too closely. And for 10 years, no one had. Not the police, not Lorman, not even Diane. The next morning, she met with Lorman at a downtown cafe, clutching the receipt in a plastic sleeve like a relic. He looked over it with tired eyes, chewing slowly on the edge of his toothpick. "I see what you mean," he muttered. "Whoever placed this wasn't trying to hide it completely, just enough to keep us from tying it to your son. Right away." Diane nodded, not trusting her voice. "But why use that name?" she finally asked. "Why not just use his real one?" Lorman leaned back, rubbing his chin. "Because it's a message, or a test. Someone wanted you to find it eventually, or maybe they thought no one would look that hard. But now we have a new lead." He pulled out his phone and began searching. "Let's try databases for that alias. Someone might have used it again." They spent the next hour combing through background checks, burner phone registries, social media accounts tied to similar names. Finally, something surfaced. An online forum for retro tech collectors showed a user profile under the name Miguel Jameson, active for a short period in late 2015, 2 years after Michael disappeared. The posts were sparse, mostly related to old pagers and analog tape recorders, but one thread caught their attention. It was titled, "Echoes of the Unplugged." The post read, "When a signal vanishes, it doesn't mean silence. Sometimes it's just moved to a lower frequency." Lorman's eyes narrowed. That's code. Someone saying the trail didn't end, it just changed channels. This user, it could be the same person who placed the order. They tracked the IP address. It led to a public library computer in Sandusky, Ohio. No security footage from that year had been retained. The trail, once again, went cold. But the psychological profile they were building began to take shape. Whoever was behind this had an understanding of systems. They were methodical. They left crumbs, carefully chosen ones. They wanted someone to follow, but only so far. Diane leaned forward. What if it wasn't just a lure? What if it was a rehearsal? Lorman blinked. Rehearsal for what? For something bigger, she said. For another disappearance, or a pattern. That thought disturbed them both. They began pulling similar missing persons reports across Ohio between 2010 and 2015, looking specifically for teenage boys who disappeared with no trace. They found 3 cases that bore eerie similarities: missing car, no phone activity, last seen picking up takeout. In one of those, the pizza place had no record of the order. In another, the receipt had only a first name Jordan, but no last. The third had no receipt at all. Diane felt like she was peering into a hall of mirrors, every case echoing Michael's in subtle but unmistakable ways. Over the next week, Diane became consumed. She pinned maps to her living room walls, marked dates with colored thread, created timelines of all known sightings, even the false ones. She printed out the profile picture from the Miguel Jameson forum account, an old cassette tape with a crack running down the middle, and stared at it daily. She told herself it was about Michael, about answers. But some part of her had shifted. It wasn't just grief anymore. It was confrontation. She was closing in on something. Then came the email, an untraceable address, no subject line. The body of the message contained only one sentence. "You're getting warmer, Diane." She stared at it, heart racing, the cursor blinking at the end like a metronome. She didn't show it to the police. She forwarded it to Lorman, who ran it through 3 different encryption filters and traced the metal date. Whoever sent it was not only aware of her investigation, they were watching. That night, Diane walked into Michael's room for the first time in months. Everything was still as he had left it, the old posters, the shelves with books arranged by series, the soft blue blanket folded at the foot of the bed. She sat down and reached under his desk, feeling for the loose panel she remembered from cleaning all those years ago. It gave way with a gentle pop. Inside was a small wooden box. It had always been there, she thought, but she had never opened it. Now she did. Inside were old receipts, movie stubs, a couple of hand-sent notes to himself, and there, folded tightly in half, a yellowed paper napkin with strange ink marks. She unfolded it carefully. It was a drawing, Michael's sketchy, rushed lines forming what looked like a street grid. A place he had visited? A place he meant to go? Lorman came over the next morning to examine it. He placed it on top of a map of Dayton and began overlaying the sketch with transparent tracing paper. "Here," he said finally, pointing, "this intersection. It doesn't exist on modern maps, but it used to, before they rezoned this whole district in 2007. "Where is it now?" Diane asked. "Buried, literally, under a new apartment complex. But back then, it was a warehouse district, like the one where they found his car." Exactly like that. They visited the address that afternoon. The apartment complex stood polished and bright, a stark contrast to the grim weight of what might be beneath it. But Diane didn't care. She stood across the street, staring at the entrance, her hand clenched into a fist around the napkin. This was something, not a full answer, but a direction. The street was quiet as Diane and Lorman sat parked across from the apartment complex that now stood over the intersection from Michael's sketch. The sunlight had faded, and shadows stretched across the pavement like fingers reaching for something buried deep beneath the surface. Lorman tapped his fingers against the steering wheel, his mind clearly racing through implications, timelines, and probability. Diane stared ahead, unmoving, her hand clutching the now crinkled napkin as if it were the only real piece of her son she had left. What she hadn't told Lorman yet, not fully, was that the name Miguel Jameson had stirred something else in her memory. Not just because it echoed Michael's own, but because, in a strange way, it felt familiar, like a name spoken once in passing, under breath, long ago. And it gnawed at her. They left the complex and returned to Diane's home just past 10 that night. She brought out a plastic file crate from the back of her bedroom closet. It was packed with clippings, police statements, forensic notes, old thumb drives containing backups of Michael's hard drive. She flipped through a folder labeled Witness Statements and stopped at a report filed by the original detective assigned to the case. In the margins was a scribbled name, Tyler Brandt. He had worked at Sergio's the night Michael disappeared. Not the one who took the phone order that had been Devinoid, but the guy who made the pizza. Diane remembered him vaguely, a thin young man with heavy metal tattoos and an awkward smile. He had always worn headphones, even while working. According to the statement, Tyler had claimed nothing seemed off that night. The order came through the system. He made the pizza, added the pineapple, boxed it up, and set it on the pickup counter. He'd even said it was one of the easier ones that shift. But then she remembered something that had been mentioned only briefly. Long ago at the time, it seemed like background noise in the hurricane of grief. Tyler had died less than a month after Michael disappeared. It was ruled accidental, a kitchen incident. He had choked during his shift, according to the report, while trying to swallow a bite of calzone during closing cleanup. No one else was in the kitchen when it happened. He was found on the floor by another employee returning from the restroom. Diane's hand hovered over the page. The report didn't elaborate on what exactly he'd choked on, or whether it was clear why he'd been eating so quickly, or alone. She felt cold rising in her spine. It was too close, too strange. The man who had physically assembled Michael's last known interaction with the world, dead, abruptly and without witnesses, just weeks after. She told Lorman. He was skeptical at first. "People choke, Diane," he said. "Happens more than you'd think." "Not like this," she replied. "Not in the same place, not the same person who touched that order." They agreed to dig deeper. Lorman tracked down the original coroner's report. Tyler's official cause of death was mechanical asphyxiation due to airway obstruction. A large undigested mass food, unchewed, had lodged in his trachea. The EMTs hadn't been able to dislodge it in time. Toxicology came back clean. No drugs, no alcohol, no signs of stroke or seizure. But there was one note. Tyler had scratch marks on his own neck, defensive in nature, as if trying to claw something off not entirely consistent with a standard choking incident. The marks were never explained. The case remained closed. But it didn't end there. As Lorman went back through employee rosters from that time, he found another strange entry. Jonas Kern worked at Sergio's part-time, quit 6 weeks after Tyler died. According to one of his co-workers at the time, Jonas claimed he was being watched by someone from the night shift. Diane found the co-worker through an old social media post. Her name was Carla, and she had moved to Indianapolis since then. Carla agreed to talk. On the video call, her face came into focus. Older, more tired than her Facebook photo, but still alert. "I remember Jonas," she said. "Quiet guy, polite. But after Tyler died, he started acting weird. Wouldn't stay in the kitchen alone. Said he felt cold spots near the walk-in freezer. Said someone kept unlocking the back door even when it was bolted." Diane leaned closer to the screen. "Did he ever say who he thought was doing it?" Carla shook her head. "No, he just kept saying, 'I saw something on the monitor,' who wasn't supposed to be there. Like the security feed caught something he couldn't explain. Then one night, he didn't show up. He never called. A few weeks later, I heard he'd gone missing." That revelation hit like a freight train. Another disappearance this time. An employee vanished without a trace not long after helping prepare the same pizza. Diane scribbled names on her wall now. Michael, Tyler, Jonas, Devin, Carla. The line connecting them felt increasingly deliberate. Lorman was already pulling missing persons records on Jonas. The police had filed an initial report but never followed up, assuming he'd left town voluntarily. Diane wasn't so sure. What connected these men? Was it the pizza order or the place itself? They decided to revisit the old Sergio's building. It was after hours, but Lorman had called in a favor and arranged for access through the new owner. The interior had changed only slightly since the old days. Some new paint, some reupholstered booths, but the bones of the place remained. The manager handed them the key to the basement and left them alone. Diane descended the narrow stairs into the cramped, dust-choked space beneath the kitchen. The air smelled of mold and faint grease. Broken crates and unused shelving lined the walls. Then she saw it. An old corkboard hanging at the far end, mostly bare but with a few curled slips of paper still pinned at odd angles. Lorman approached and removed one carefully. It was a time card dated the week Michael disappeared. Tyler's initials were on it, so were Jonas. Nothing unusual until they noticed a third set of initials scrawled beside each line. Diane's breath froze. "Michael Jennings," she whispered. "Why would his initials be down here?" "They wouldn't," Lorman said. "Not unless someone was playing games. Or—" He trailed off. Diane stepped backward, eyes scanning the floor. Her foot hit something soft. She looked down. A square of folded paper, aged and torn, poked from beneath a shelving unit. She crouched and picked it up, unfolded it slowly. It was a napkin, the same kind used upstairs, and on it, in faint black ink, were 4 words. "I didn't order this." The words sent a shock through her chest. It was Michael's handwriting. She knew it like her own. Slanted, hurried, the way he used to jot notes for homework. "He was here," she said, her voice shaking. "He came down here. He left this—" Lorman scanned the area. "If this stayed hidden for 10 years, nobody's been down here seriously since then." He took the napkin from her, bagged it. Diane stood still, her hands trembling. The pizzeria had always been the starting point, but now it felt more like the stage, the place where something was orchestrated, where people began to disappear, where Michael had been misled, maybe even cornered. She didn't know yet who the conductor was, but she knew the music had been playing far longer than anyone had realized. The discovery in the basement, that torn napkin scribbled with Michael's unmistakable handwriting, had shattered something in Diane. It wasn't just proof he had entered the basement of Sergio's, it was a cry for help. A message. The words, "I didn't order this," looped in her head endlessly over the next few days. It suggested not just confusion, but fear. It was the kind of sentence someone writes quickly, urgently perhaps, knowing that time is slipping away. Diane took the napkin home, even though Lorman had argued it belonged in evidence. But she couldn't let it go, not yet. She placed it inside a protective sleeve and pinned it to her living room wall, just above the receipt with the wrong name, just below the map Michael had drawn. Each clue formed a constellation only she could see, and she knew, absolutely knew, they were connected by more than coincidence. Her next move came to her late at night, as she sat in her robe, tea gone cold, flipping through an old photo album she had assembled the year after Michael vanished. It contained pictures of him at school, on trips, and oddly enough, inside Sergio's Pizza, laughing with friends at a birthday party in one of the booths, her eyes locked on a photo where Michael sat in a far corner next to a window with stained glass sunbeams, nearly hidden from view. Something about that booth tugged at her memory. The following afternoon, Diane returned to the restaurant, now rebranded with a slick Mediterranean name and a bright teal sign, the paint still smelling new. The new owners had remodeled the front, installed modern lighting, even added QR code menus. But some elements of the original Sergio's remained, stubborn ghosts unwilling to fade. Diane slid into a booth and casually glanced around. That's when she noticed that the back left corner of the restaurant had been sealed off with a decorative divider, a cheap wooden lattice screen, and potted fake ferns arranged to block access. A velvet rope completed the barrier, looped between two brass poles as if the space beyond were being preserved for some future renovation that never came. But it hadn't always been that way. She remembered sitting in that booth once herself, waiting for an order while Michael watched the pizza dough being tossed in the open kitchen. And now, for some reason, that space had been hidden. Her pulse quickened. She waited until the restaurant thinned out. Just before closing, when the last customers began trickling out and the kitchen staff turned to clean up, Diane stood, made her way toward the divider, and casually slipped behind it. The air felt colder back there, and the lighting didn't quite reach the shadowed corner. Dust floated lazily in the still air. The booth itself remained intact, old vinyl cushions cracked with age, and a small table with a glass-covered menu that hadn't been updated since the Sergio's era. She stepped in, heart racing. Her eyes scanned the walls, the floor, the corners. Nothing obvious. But then she crouched to check under the booth seats and noticed something jammed tightly into the seam where the cushion met the back panel. A corner of thermal paper, the kind used for receipts. Diane's hands trembled as she pried it free. The paper was curled and brown at the edges, ink faded but still legible. Her eyes scanned the text. Pizza, large, pepperoni, Papper order time, 9:47 p.m. Her breath caught. That timestamp was nearly 2 hours after Michael had vanished. She stared at the numbers, confused. The receipt listed the same toppings as Michael's order, but carried a different order number, 1147, and no name. Diane sat down hard, mind spinning. Why would there be another order with the same bizarre topping combination, placed 2 hours later and hidden away in a part of the restaurant that had since been sealed off? She pulled out her phone and dialed Lorman. He picked up after 2 rings. "I found something," she whispered. "A second receipt, same pizza, 2 hours later, tucked under a booth they sealed off." There was silence on the line. Then, "Bring it to me, now." She wrapped the receipt in tissue and drove to Lorman's office. He examined it under a magnifying glass. Same printer, same format. This is a Sergio's receipt, no question. Why was it back there? She asked. Why hide it? Lorman exhaled slowly. If I were guessing, someone placed a second order to test the system, maybe to see if someone would respond, maybe to recreate the condition. Or, Diane said, the words catching in her throat, maybe they were waiting for someone else. Or sending a signal, Lorman added grimly. They contacted the current restaurant manager and asked for access to archived POF pointers, point-of-sale data, claiming it was for an article on local business history. The manager hesitated but eventually agreed to email over whatever he could find. When the file arrived, Lorman scoured the logs from that date. Sure enough, Order 1147 existed, but it had been manually entered, not placed through the regular interface. No phone number attached, no delivery address, just the time and the toppings. Someone entered this order from inside, Lorman muttered. That means the person was here, after Michael vanished. Diane's mind reeled. She revisited the basement napkin. The words took on a more terrifying tone now. I didn't order this could have referred not just to the pineapple pizza, but to something more sinister. Had someone tried to use Michael to signal a message? Or worse, bait another person? She stared at the list of names on her wall. Michael, Tyler, Devin, Carla. Now, there was a new name to add, even if it was only hypothetical. The person who had placed Order 1147. The question remained, why use pineapple again? Why the same topping that Michael had hated and Diane now saw as a symbol? Was it a signature, a calling card, a way of marking connected events without drawing attention from outsiders? It was too specific to be random, too deliberate to be meaningless. That night, Diane couldn't sleep. She dreamed of the booth, of sitting in the shadows while someone watched from the kitchen, unseen. In the dream, the receipt was still in her hand, but the ink began to bleed, smearing the timestamp until it vanished completely. She woke in a cold sweat. The following day, Lorman visited a former Sergio's employee who had moved to Toledo and now worked in a bar. She had cleaned the restaurant during overnight shifts in 2013. Her name was Alicia. When asked about the sealed booth, she frowned. That one? Yeah, I remember. After Tyler died, they shut that section off, said it was too much of a reminder. But I heard other things. Weird stuff. Diane leaned forward. What kind of weird? Alicia hesitated. One night around 10, I was mopping the floor and heard someone whispering back there. Thought maybe a couple of kids snuck in, but when I looked, the booth was empty. Still had a soda cup sitting on the table, though, with ice, like someone had just been mentioning it. Said we were being paranoid. Lorman and Diane left the meeting shaken. The idea that someone had not only been using the booth after Michael vanished, but deliberately, quietly, and repeatedly painted a terrifying picture. The sealed area was less about renovation and more about avoidance, like the management had known something happened there, and instead of reporting it, they shut it away. Diane thought about that second receipt again. Someone had sat there, alone, recreating the exact order Michael never wanted, and left a receipt behind, like a breadcrumb. It no longer felt like they were uncovering random coincidences. It felt like they were reading the lines of a story someone else had written, and had desperately tried to keep buried. The discovery of the second receipt haunted Diane, but it also renewed something that had dulled in her over the years: focus. She no longer floated in the vast helplessness of wondering what had happened to her son. Now she moved with purpose, each step deliberate, each question sharper. The booth had been hidden, the receipt had been planted. Someone had recreated the moment of Michael's disappearance for a reason, and that meant someone had stayed close, all this time, watching, feeding crumbs just close enough for her to find. She returned to her files again, this time pulling out Michael's senior yearbook. It was an old habit, flipping through its pages, touching the corners of photographs where his smile lingered, the way his eyes crinkled in the light, the familiar curve of his shoulder standing among teammates on the soccer field. She turned pages slowly, revisiting the class candids, the hallway scenes, the group shots from pep rallies and after-school clubs. Then something strange began to catch her attention, something she'd seen before but never fully noticed. In the background of several photos spaced months apart was the same figure, A girl, tall and thin, her hair dark and always obscuring part of her face. In one picture, she stood behind the fencing at a soccer match. In another, she leaned against the lockers near the science wing. In a third, she sat alone at a cafeteria table with her head tilted toward the corner, eyes downcast, as if pretending not to be seen. But in each, she was positioned close to Michael. Not next to him, not obviously, but always within the frame. Diane stared harder. The girl's face was never entirely visible. In one photo, the lighting had cast a glare on the lens. In another, she stood just outside the camera's focus. No name was listed beside her. No signature appeared in the back of the yearbook. Curious, Diane flipped to the student index, running her finger down the list of names, checking each one against faces she didn't recognize. The girl wasn't listed anywhere. She made a photocopy of the clearest image and sent it to Lorman, who responded within the hour. "Let me run it through facial recognition," he said. "We'll see if we get anything." While she waited, Diane visited Michael's old high school. The building had been remodeled, but the main office retained its original wood-paneled counter and smell of pencil shavings and carpet cleaner. She met with the current guidance counselor, who offered to help retrieve archived class records from the 2012-201 school year. They pulled up digital rosters. Diane combed through them carefully, name by name, cross-referencing ID photos with the image of the girl from the yearbook. No matched. "Are you sure she was a student here?" the counselor asked. Diane shook her head. "She's in several pictures, always near my son, but there's no name, no ID, no signature. It's like she was never officially here." The counselor leaned in. "We had some open periods then. Students from nearby private schools could take electives here. Maybe she was one of them." It was possible, but it still felt wrong. Diane's instincts screamed louder now. This girl wasn't random. She had been present, close, but invisible. That night, Lorman called. "I found something," he said. Her image comes up in one surveillance capture from a bus terminal in 2014, Dayton Central Station. A girl matching that description boarded a bus headed north the morning after Michael's disappearance. Diane's breath hitched. "Are you sure?" "Not 100%, he replied. "The footage is grainy, but the timestamp matches. She had a backpack, alone, no ticket purchased under her name. We checked all known aliases." Diane felt the floor tilt beneath her. Was Michael with her? "No," Lorman said. "But here's the weird part. She gets on the bus, sits for about 2 stops, then gets off before it even leaves Dayton. Never seen again." "She wanted to be seen," Diane whispered, "just long enough to leave a trail, then vanish." Maybe, or maybe she thought someone was following her too. They traced the bus stop she exited, an old industrial junction near the riverfront. Nothing was there now but rusting warehouses and chain-link fences. Diane and Lorman went the next morning, walking the uneven pavement between skeletal buildings. At the far edge of the lot, beneath a defunct billboard, they found something small but chilling. An old notebook, sun-bleached and water-stained, stuffed behind a pipe. Most pages were ruined, illegible, but on one, in faint ink, were 2 words repeated over and over. "It watched." Lorman bagged it carefully. "If she left this," he said, voice tight, "then she knew something." Diane stood silently, the wind tugging her coat. Her mind pieced together a new possibility. Michael had been watched, the booth had been sealed, the second pizza had been made, but maybe he wasn't the only target. Maybe someone else was close to the truth. A girl no one remembered, a face blurred in every photo. She thought of the napkin again, Michael's desperate messages. "I didn't order this," and now this girl vanishing after a silent bus ride, leaving behind the words, "It watched." This wasn't just a disappearance. This was a pattern. Someone had been choreographing movements behind the scenes, casting shadows into photographs, planting signals into pizza orders, and now possibly watching them both. Diane was no longer searching for just her son. She was hunting the invisible force that had kept all of this hidden for a decade, and she was getting closer. The image of the girl haunted Diane, her blurred figure carved permanently into the backdrop of Michael's final school days, a ghost in the margins. Her notebook, found tucked behind a pipe near a forgotten bus stop, repeated the chilling phrase, "It watched," over and over. like a whispered warning from the past. Diane couldn't escape the feeling that this girl had been trying to leave a map, to mark the places where eyes were always watching, and perhaps something went very wrong. After the discovery, Diane sat with Lorman in his cluttered office, sipping bitter coffee and staring at a printed yearbook page pinned to the wall. The girl's obscured face circled in red ink. They had exhausted public records, alumni databases, even old disciplinary logs. Whoever she was, she had made a choice to stay hidden, or someone else had worked hard to erase her. That's when Diane's mind circled back to something mundane, yet sharp with memory. "Michael's locker," she said abruptly. Lorman raised an eyebrow. "What about it?" "It was in the West Wing, near the art classrooms," she said. "He hated the East hallway, said it smelled like old bleach and always made his asthma flare up. He begged to stay West Side." "All right," Lorman muttered, tapping into his contact at the school district. After an hour, the email reply arrived. "Michael Jennings, assigned locker, 281, East Wing Hall, C, second row from the end." Diane frowned, her lips tightening. "That's not right. He never had an East Wing locker." "Could it have been switched?" Lorman asked. "I would have remembered," Diane replied. "He complained about that hallway all year." They decided to investigate. 2 days later, under the pretense of academic research, they obtained permission to access the school's locker archives. There in the cafeteria guidance, they found locker 2.21 at the far end of Hall C. It hadn't been assigned since 2013. The janitor unlocked it and swung the door open. It creaked softly, revealing an empty interior, barren save for a few scratches, rusted corners, and a thin layer of dust. Diane stepped closer. Something about the locker felt off. The way the air inside smelled faintly metallic, how the space was unusually cold. She leaned in. That's when she saw the etching, faint, almost lost in the scratched surface, but there, deliberate, human, desperate. The words read, "Check the blue locker, not this one." Her heart thundered. "Lorma?" she whispered, pointing. He moved closer, reading the message in silence. Then he turned to the janitor. "Was this always Michael's locker?" The janitor hesitated. "Records say so, but lockers get reassigned. Sometimes we forget to update paperwork. I can check older logs." Diane held her breath. "Do you have a list from the week Michael disappeared?" "Might be," the janitor said. "Give me a few minutes." They waited in the hallway, surrounded by rows of lockers, each a silent metal tomb of forgotten teenage clutter. 15 minutes later, the janitor returned, a clipboard in hand. "Here, week of the 10th, says Jennings was assigned 317. West Wing. But the district files don't show that. Guess someone edited the records later." Lorman muttered a curse. Diane didn't answer. She was already walking. They reached the West Wing. Locker 217 stood halfway down the corridor, its paint slightly chipped, but a dull navy blue beneath the institutional gray. Diane reached for the handle. It was locked. The janitor used his master key. The lock clicked, and the door creaked open. The interior was dark, but immediately they saw it wasn't empty. Folded into the corner was a notebook, smaller than the one found near the bus stop, but similar in style. Weathered, its cover warped by time and perhaps moisture. Diane opened it slowly, each page heavy with dust and history. Inside, written in pen, were fragments of thoughts, sketches, half-sentences. On the third page, in black letters, he said it would be fast. He lied. Diane's hands trembled. She turned the next page, a crude drawing of a booth, nearly identical to the one in Sergio's corner. A figure seated, another in shadow standing behind. No faces, no context, just lines of ink thick with menace. Beneath the sketch, "Not alone, not ever, it hears everything." Lorman leaned over. "Do you think Michael wrote this?" "Maybe," Diane whispered. "Or maybe the girl did." She flipped through the rest. On the final page, dated just 2 days before Michael's disappearance, a message. "If I go missing, tell my mom I didn't choose it." Diane had to sit down. Her knees gave slightly as the weight of the sentence sank in. "That's Michael," she said, her voice breaking. "That's something he would say." Lorman nodded. "So someone changed the records, reassigned his locker on paper, and left this message behind, hoping no one would find it." "Until now," Diane said. She looked around the hallway. So ordinary, so harmless. Yet here, in the seams of metal and paper, lay proof that Michael knew he was being watched, that he feared something. Someone. That he tried to warn them. She thought of the girl again, always nearby, silent, and yet also leaving signals, a shared code of fear etched into lockers and napkins and notebooks. She looked at Lorman. He didn't just vanish, he was erased, and someone went through a lot of trouble to make sure no one questioned it. They brought the notebook to a forensic analyst. The ink matched pens sold in local stores during 2013. The writing showed signs of tension, tremors, inconsistent pressure, suggesting fear, or perhaps Michael had written while in hiding. But one thing was certain, it wasn't planted recently. The dust, the oxidation of the staples, the adhesive residue from a decade-old label on the back confirmed it had been untouched for years. Diane stared at the analyst's report, unable to decide whether the confirmation comforted or terrified her more. Back home, she pinned the newest message onto her evidence wall. Strings now crisscrossed the entire space, from yearbook photos to school maps to sketches and receipts. Each clue, once isolated, now sang in unison. She stood there a long time. Then she picked up a marker and wrote across the top of the wall, "He didn't choose it." The moment Diane stepped inside the abandoned storage room in the basement of the restaurant, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. She had returned with Lorman earlier that afternoon after reviewing a faint reference to a hidden door in Michael's notebook. The notes had described a secret entrance below the booth, and the layout matched a small maintenance door in the back wall of the basement, something she had overlooked in every previous sweep. With a heavy steel door now unlocked, Diane and Lorman descended into darkness, scanning with flashlights until beams fell on a small carpeted room tucked behind shelving. Inside, the air was musty, heavy with decades of neglect, and the walls were lined with old photographs, scribbled journals, and yellowing newspaper clippings. Diane's heart pounded as she stepped forward, the hush so complete it echoed. Her mind raced with a mix of curiosity and dread. Had this place been preserved by Michael? By the girl? Or was it some twisted archive compiled by whoever had orchestrated all of this? Dust motes floated in the flashlight beam as Diane gently lifted a journal from a small wooden desk in the center of the room. The leather cover bore the initials MM in capital letters, crudely etched. Her breath stuttered, but she turned the volume and read. The handwriting was familiar, Michael's own script, careful but shaky, each letter heavy with tension. The first entry was dated 3 years before his disappearance. It spoke in whispers about feeling like someone was always watching him, that he sometimes found traces of himself in places he'd never been, like photos that included his presence before he arrived. One passage said, "I saw myself existing before I was there. It terrifies me, but I can't stop finding evidence." What is happening? Later pages described the booth at the restaurant, scribbled sketches of the corner with notes like, "Cold spot behind me, shadow under the table, unsent message." "I didn't order the pizza." Diane's throat tightened. Michael had known something was wrong. He had noted it all here, not just the notebook in his locker, but this room. Behind him, someone had kept a record, or someone had forced him to. She turned, think about the photos pinned to the walls. One was a faded shot of Michael in a soccer uniform, but the image was digitally altered, someone's shadowy figure lurking behind him, blurred like a ghost. Another photo showed the girl from the yearbook, standing just out of reach, but unmistakable. Beneath each photograph, someone had added dates and tiny code letters, M6, P2, S3. Piecing it together, Diane realized it was an index of events and places, a ledger of the moments when Michael and the girl had crossed paths with something no one else saw. She stepped to a musical cabin and pulled down a small box marked Backup. Inside were newspaper clippings about the 2 employees who disappeared, Tyler and Locker messages. Someone had archived them here, in this secret space. Lorman flicked on a lamp, and the weak fluorescent bulb hummed to life, casting harsh light across the room. He ran a gloved hand over a journal labeled M. Final. Diane opened it and found the final entries, scribbled in a frenzy just days before Michael disappeared. They read like a fragmented confession. "They know I'm onto them, Tonight I will follow. Then, don't look for me. I didn't choose it. Diane's eyes burned with tears. He had known. He had been guided there, willingly or not, and then vanished. He had recorded every detail in a hidden room he built beneath the place that betrayed him. They stepped outside, the stale air of the basement replaced by the scent of cleaning supplies in the main restaurant. Diane's mind spun. This room was a confession, a memorial, and a beacon, all at once. It meant Michael never left willingly. He was following instructions, clues, forced or encouraged to remain inside a pattern orchestrated by someone else. And the person he called they had remained one step ahead, observing, controlling, erasing. That night, Diane lay awake in her bed, the image of the secret room imprinted on her mind. She stared at her wall covered in strings and photos, connected by red lines and yellowing notes, each one pointing toward whom. She closed her eyes and saw Michael's final page. I will sit in the booth. I will wait. There was a step into the booth. She would wait. She would follow the path Michael had left behind. She would confront the watchers. The morning after they found the hidden room, Diane stood in front of Sergio's restaurant again, her coat pulled tight against a spring wind that felt too cold for May. The streets were quiet, and the rising sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk, just like it had the day Michael vanished. She looked up at the windows, wondering if someone was behind them now, watching her the way they had watched him. In her hand was the final journal from the room, carefully zipped in a plastic case. Inside were Michael's last entries, the ones Lorman had read aloud in silence the night before, both of them sitting there, numb. If they show me the way, I will follow. Don't look for me. I didn't choose it as a record of fear, but as something deeper, a surrender to something he had once tried to resist. Diane didn't enter the restaurant. She went around back, where the delivery trucks used to unload, and stood at the rusted door that led into the basement. Lorman met her minutes later, bringing 2 officers from the local department who had reopened the cold case now that physical evidence had emerged. Together they descended the steps. The room was just as they had left it, undisturbed, lit only by the thin beam of sunlight that filtered through a grating in the wall. But the floor had changed. Where dust once sat undisturbed, there were now faint patterns. Shoe prints. Recent ones. The prints were too small to belong to Lorman or the officers. One set had a distinct heel drag, as if someone had limped or shuffled their way through the room. Someone had come here after them. Someone had returned to the shrine of Michael's unvavering. The forensic team took photos and samples. They lifted fingerprints off the desk and found fibers on the chair. In the corner, behind a loose wall panel, they discovered an old duffel bag filled with journals, food wrappers, and a flashlight with dead batteries. An ID badge buried at the bottom of the bag confirmed the impossible. It belonged to Frederick Hoyt, a man who had once worked maintenance at the restaurant over a decade ago. Hoyt had no criminal record, but he'd been fired in 2014 for erratic behavior. According to a manager's old statement, Hoyt had been seen muttering to himself, claiming the restaurant had a voice that talked through the booths. He said he was protecting people, watching the signals. Most had laughed it off as mental illness. He disappeared later that year, found dead 3 years ago in a river several states away. The coroner had ruled it drowning. But now his belongings were in a hidden room, arranged carefully, maintaining, journal entries still being added in handwriting that didn't match Hoyt's. This revelation broke something open in the investigation. If Hoyt had died 3 years ago, then someone else had continued his work. The entries in the last journal included dates from just 6 months ago. The most recent one read, "She's close. He told me in the static. The mother is listening now." Diane stood in the room as that sentence was read aloud. It made her knees shake. She could feel her son's voice echoing from the past, twisted through someone else's belief, someone else's madness. The investigators expanded their search. They traced old phone records and discovered that Hoyt had communicated with someone anonymously through encrypted messages using a public library terminal. Someone whose chat logs revealed a disturbing detail. Hoyt had not been acting alone. He referred to a second person only as 1-1, someone who helped maintain the network, someone who made the blueprints of the floor plan. They were looking for a partner, a successor, maybe even a disciple. In a twist no one expected, the footprint match came back to a current employee of a nearby bookstore, Walter Driggs. A man in his early 40s, soft-spoken, quiet, helpful. Lived alone, never married. When police searched his apartment, they found clippings of the Michael Jennings case pinned to his bedroom wall. A copy of the "I Didn't Order This" napkin, 2 dozens of notebooks mimicking the style of Michael's journals, filled with fictional entries where Walter wrote as if he were Michael, living out a fantasy where he was so saved by the Watchers from a fate worse than death. Driggs confessed, in pieces, to keeping the room, to continuing the messages, to watching Diane, observing her pain, believing she had been chosen to understand the warning. But he denied ever meeting Michael in person. "I only kept the place alive," he said. "The story needed to breathe." The revelation rocked Diane. It was not a clean answer, but it was an answer. Hoyt had manipulated Michael, possibly objected him, possibly lured him into the underground, convinced him of some paranoid belief about danger and Watchers. Diane would never know what happened in that final moment, whether her son had fought or trusted or surrendered to something larger than himself. But she knew this: he hadn't been alone. He had left messages, maps, resistance. He had tried to break through the silence. Michael's body was never found, but the room was enough. The journals were enough. The receipts and napkins and shadows were enough. They told the world what had happened. A young man watched by someone who believed he was saving him. Another man, years later, obsessed with the myth, where the story that lived in hidden corners and whispered echoes, in the backs of booths and sealed lockers, waiting to be noticed. So in the end, Diane stood in the old restaurant one last time, alone. The booth was still there, now unsealed, now part of the public again. She sat in it quietly, her hand resting on the table. She closed her eyes and listened, not for ghosts or static or Watchers, but for her son's voice, clear and honest, as she remembered it before the story bent his life into something else. She heard it in the silence between words, in the stillness of her breath. He had wanted to be found. He had wanted her to see. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, make sure to like and subscribe for more real-feeling mystery stories just like this one. I'd love to know what you think. Which twist shocked you the most? And where are you watching from today? Drop a comment.